Welcome to the Farmhouse. I'm Stephanie Spiker.
And I'm Candace Wierzbowski.
This week, I got the chance to talk to Hilary Haigh. She's a livestock and dairy farmer in Vermont. And Hilary and her husband first opened Rolling Bale Farm back in 2014. And there they raise grass-fed beef and lamb. And then in 2022, they got the opportunity to buy the Animal Farm Creamery from its creator, Diane St. Clair. And at the creamery, Hilary and her family milk a herd of Jersey cows, and they make their own very high-end butter. And this is pretty special butter. It's almost only sold wholesale, and it's sold to restaurants like the Inn at Little Washington, Per Se, and the French Laundry, which, if any of you, pay attention to culinary things, those names might sound familiar.
Very fancy schmancy.
Candace, have you ever eaten at a very fancy restaurant, or even just in general experience like really high quality, like farm fresh ingredients?
I've never eaten at somewhere on the level of any of those restaurants.
Yeah, me neither.
But I would say that I have been very fortunate to have eaten at some very nice restaurants, I would say. There is, though, nothing that really stands out as far as wow, that was incredible, farm fresh food. There was some incredible food. How recently it had come from the farm, I don't know.
That's fair. Well, I really guess I've never thought that much about butter until I talked to Hilary, and I was pretty fascinated to learn the whole process. So I'm excited for you, Candace, to hear it, and for all of you listeners to hear this interview. So let's get to know Hilary. Hilary, welcome to the Farmhouse. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
You run two distinct ag enterprises, Rolling Bale Farm and Animal Farm Creamery. How did you get into farming with Rolling Bale, and then what led you to adding on years later with the creamery?
Yeah, so my husband Ben and we started Rolling Bale Farm in 2014. I had grown up doing a mix of farming things with my family, my mom in particular, where we raised chickens and sheep and beef and pigs, sort of everything except for dairy. And my love for farming really stemmed from that. And I think I just kind of knew I wanted to be a farmer. I'm not necessarily sure that I was yes, I'm going to be a farmer to everyone who asked me per se, but I think in my heart it was just there, and I just always sort of worked towards that. And then Ben, he came into farming when he was in college, and he would work on his uncle's dairy farm, and sort of realized at that point that he genuinely loved farming, and his interest grew from there. And so together in 2014, we decided that we would start Rolling Bale Farm. And that has just continued to grow. Of course, when we started Rolling Bale Farm, we weren't both just full-time farmers. Starting up a farm, it's mostly you have to work full-time off the farm, and then the farm is sort of what you do after your work. So Rolling Bale Farm was that for us for at least a few years. I think it was 3 or 4 years into farming that I became a full-time farmer, and then Ben still worked off the farm until we brought on the dairy piece of it. And the dairy piece is Animal Farm Creamery, and it was an established business that we purchased from a woman who lives one town over in Orwell. And so once we brought that dairy enterprise on, Ben was able to become a full-time farmer as well. So now for the last 3 years, we have both been full-time, and it's been really wonderful and amazing how long it's taken, as a startup farmer to become both full-time farmers.
So we're going to talk plenty about the creamery and especially the butter in a bit coming up, but I wanted to start with asking you about your livestock operation. So on your website, you mention how your breed selection plus pasture management leads to tender, marbled, flavorful meat. So I'd love to know more about both parts of that. So first of all, what livestock breeds do you raise and what traits are you specifically looking for?
So for our sheep, it's a Dorset cross block. So most of the genetics there are from Dorset sheep, which are known to be really good on pasture. And we have found that to be very true. We intensively rotationally graze all of our livestock. So for us, we were looking for breeds that were not enormous, ones that could fill out well on grass and hay and did not have to be supplemented with grain. So for both the sheep and the beef, that was one of our standards. And then animals who were well suited to, of course, living outdoors were a little bit hardier. And so for the sheep, the Dorset is definitely the case there. They are a wool and a meat breed, which I find is great because the wool breeds tend to be just a little bit larger than some of the hair breeds. Maybe I'm getting too specific here. I'm not really sure.
Hey, that's all right. I mean, if anyone listening is looking to getting into sheep, I'm sure they'd love specifics.
The specifics. Well, great, because I could talk forever on any one of these topics. But just to jump back to our breed selection, it also, for the sheep, goes back to the sheep I had growing up, which this flock was one that actually my mom had started back in 2000. And with her, we both brought in different genetics to see what worked best. So at first we had Border Leicester sheep and they were mostly a wool breed. And then we brought in Icelandic ram because there was one available from our neighbor. And then from there we tried a couple different breeds and ended up landing on Dorset and found that the yield from the carcass from a Dorset cross was substantially greater than any of the other breeds we had tried. So that was sort of my basis for, okay, we've experimented enough growing up to know that this Dorset works really well in our system and in our climate, to go forward with that. And then for the beef, Ben and I actually, when we started our farm in 2014, did a lot of research on what kind of genetics we wanted. And to tell you the truth, I don't know specifically why, but we did land on a breed called Red Pole cattle. We thought that they seemed the best suited for what we were doing. You know, we needed a calmer animal because we didn't have a lot of infrastructure. And we needed one that was medium sized, that filled out well in grass, and could be, of course, like I said, resilient to our climate. So we actually spent a bit of time and probably a little more money than we should have purchasing a small starter herd of Red Pole cattle. And we farmed with those cattle until 2021. And then it was then with our purchase of the dairy and our analysis of all of our animals and livestock that we realized that the Red Pole cattle were actually not very well suited for what we were doing. You know, we just kind of had constant calving issues. They were really not that hardy. They tasted wonderful, but they just had such a hard time dealing with our bugs and our heat that we couldn't get them to fill out the way we wanted on pasture. So with that in mind, we actually ended up getting rid of all of our Red Poles, and we are now breeding all of our dairy cows, which are Jersey, not all of them, but most of them, to beef genetics. And we're doing Angus at this point because we know that Angus finishes out really well on pasture. And we've avoided Angus in the past because Ben and I have both worked at one of his uncle's farm in Australia where they raise Angus, and they're just so wild. And it was like so insane. You know, we had to, herd them all up once and treat them for pink eye. And it was just like, it just felt like such a rodeo. And I was like, we could never do that on our farm. Like, we just have single polywire strands, like if they get out and they're running down the road, people don't know how to deal with that. So that's why we had gravitated away from Angus towards a calmer breed. But for what we're doing, I think an Angus would have been more ideal, or perhaps like a Devon or something like that. But we just really were stuck on this thought that there's some really awesome breeds that are not around here, but they're not around here for a reason. So anyway, we have started breeding our Jerseys to Angus, the ones that we don't need to keep replacement heifers from. And that has become our foundation for all of our beef. And we just had the first ones processed at the end of last summer, and they were absolutely fantastic. I was not sure how it was going to come out because they fill out, a dairy cross fills out a lot differently than a beef cross. And I know that the meat to bone ratio isn't quite as good as a full beef breed. So sending it in, I was like, I don't know, but they came back really nice, and they had excellent flavor. Oh yeah. Anyway, so that our genetic selection there sort of morphed from a breed we thought was suitable to, okay, we have this other foundation herd of cattle. How can we utilize it to get beef?
Yeah. I mean, that's interesting that, you know, even over like the past decade you've been farming, that you're still learning new things and making changes and adjustments over the years. So
yeah, I feel like every year we sort of have these like, oh, aha, you know, this is what we should be doing. And it at that point, when you have that light bulb moment, it seems to ends up being very successful, you know.
yeah.
Broiler chickens for a long time, that was for Rolling Bale Farm, that was sort of our number one product and cash flow. It was really a good way for us to draw customers to our farm because everyone knew what chicken was and everyone wanted farm raised chicken. And we actually moved away from that. Last summer was my first summer not raising chickens. Because with the dairy, we found we no longer needed the cash flow that the broilers had brought us before. And I was really ready for a break from processing chickens every week, all summer long.
Yeah.
So the broiler chickens, we actually raised a breed called Freedom Ranger. And we selected that breed specifically because our chickens were going to be pastured, and we had tried some Cornish cross years ago, my mom and I did, and just were really unhappy with their performance on pasture. You know, we weren't using like the Salatin style housing. It was more like really ranging birds. Mm-hmm. And found that the Freedom Rangers really outperformed the Cornish cross in that system because they would actually search for the bugs and dig through the soil for their entire life, not just for like a glorious 2 weeks before they got too heavy.
Yeah.
So I think maybe someday we will go back to broilers because we really miss having that meat around and for our customers, but it was the right decision to make, especially while we have this new baby here.
Yes. So as for pasture management, over your past like decade farming, what have you found works best for you guys on your operation?
So for our meat, we do, for the sheep, they get a very intensively managed rotation. So I move the flock every 1 or 3 days, depending on the time of year, the pasture they're in, you know, the growth of the height of the feed. So it's really important that the small ruminants like the sheep, who are so sensitive to internal parasites, that they get managed specifically for parasites. And that's my number one goal when I'm grazing the sheep, because the sheep are so hardy and able to gain weight on feed that is a little bit subpar, but they cannot gain weight if they are fighting internal parasites. The lambs specifically is what I'm managing for. The ewes are a little more tolerant of parasites, but for our lambs, they really need to get moved every 1 to 3 days before they have ingested any of the larvae or eggs that have been shed. And we found that the system with the system, we're able to reach, this year, our hanging weights are 60 pounds average on a grass-fed lamb, which our goal has always been 50 because it's always been hard to break out of that mid 40s range for a lamb carcass on grass. But our goal has been 60 pounds and we reached it this year and I'm really excited about it. And it just sort of, and we also haven't, I haven't dewormed the sheep since 2015. So we don't do any dewormers. Yeah, it was sort of the no deworming thing was also an aha moment for me. I always grew up raising the sheep this way with the intense rotational grazing, but I was like, wait a minute, if I just like increase their paddock size, there was some really tiny things that we were able to change in order to get our larger carcass.
Yeah.
And then the beef, I haven't quite reached my goal with the beef yet. I feel like I've been struggling with them since we started farming. But, my goal would be to be able to move them like 2 times a week to fresh pasture, which I've been able to do with the beef until we brought in the dairy. And then my time has been put in other places. So the beef was moved like once a week to larger areas of pasture. So we don't really let any animals ever run out of feed. It's sort of with a grass operation, a number one thing is like the animals, they can just winter, summer, they can never run out of feed. They always have to have feed in front of them in order to put on weight and keep from backsliding. So the beef always had enough feed, but they would end up having to wander a little further to find it, which is not ideal. Mm-hmm. So with some infrastructure changes in fencing this summer, which we have gotten some grant money for, I'm hoping to be able to move the cattle at least twice a week, but more if I end up having time.
Yeah. So it surprised me a little bit to see on your website that you've moved away from selling at farmers markets and now do it either in bulk or by the piece through orders and at a self-serve farm stand. So what kind of led to that decision, and has it affected your customer base at all, either negatively or positively?
Yeah, so the farmers market was really essential for us when we first started Rolling Bale Farm because I was able to talk to customers one-on-one and really sell our product. And I got to know so many customers really, really well that way. And I couldn't have the success that we have right now without having done that. And I think I did farmers market for, I think it was 8 years until I stepped away. The reason being mostly because when the dairy came on, now almost all of my time is spent in the creamery and milking cows. And my weekends and the days I don't have in the creamery are really, they're really important for our family to have that time together without the stress of me packing up and heading to market and standing there for 4 hours and trying to figure out what to do with the kids and can they come and do I have to juggle them and getting home and unpacking and then finding out, oh, well, I only sold like a handful of stuff today. It's just the unreliability of that is not worth the stress at this point. And because I had put in so much time and effort at the beginning of our farming career, I built a very strong and very loyal customer base. And when I stepped away from market, they're like, well, how are we going to get your meat? I was like, oh, yeah, that's a good point. I was like, you know what? I have a bank of freezers at home. I'm just going to put a sign out there and you can come whenever you want and you can just do it yourself. And they're like, great, wonderful. And then when the pandemic happened, that was a very welcome way to buy meat because no one wanted to be around anyone else. So the self-serve part of that was really helpful for the growth of the stand. People really sought them out around here and we sold out of meat pretty quickly during those couple of years. But yes, I think it was an essential move for me. Now I actually sell all of our meat through this very rustic self-serve farm stand here on the farm. There's no, it's like in a shed. There's no walls, so the snow blows in. It's like it's really there's no lights. I tell people to come during the daylight hours. And our road where we live, it's not on the way to anywhere. It's like 3 miles down this really tiny winding dirt road. So I'm always surprised when I find that I'm actually selling out of stuff. However, going forward, I do worry that I will have to make some more efforts to sell more meat because I've sort of just been riding off of my initial relationships that I've made. And it has grown. Like there has been some word of mouth from my loyal customers. People tell other people to come out here and they get recommendations. So that's very helpful. That's always been the number one way for us to sell anything is through word of mouth. So that still continues, but yeah, I will need to do some other stuff going forward because we're still expanding our flock of sheep. That's really the hardest thing to sell is lamb because it's just a meat that people are not familiar with. The beef sells so easy, but the lamb is a little more challenging.
Yeah, I will say I've personally never cooked with lamb before. I've had lamb, but I've never actually used it. I definitely cook with beef a lot. So yeah, I'm sure that's definitely a little harder to get people to just try something new even. So
it is hard. And there's such a stigma with lamb. A lot of people have had some really bad lamb, or mutton. And the taste of some really lean old mutton it's not fun to eat. So I don't really blame people, but when you have some good lamb, it's the most succulent, amazing, tender thing you've ever eaten. So once I get, that was the beauty of farmers market is I could sell people on the lamb because I could talk to them about it and get them to try it. And then they would come back for more. So, but yeah.
All right, so let's get into talking about the creamery. So I spent just one summer working on a dairy farm, so I know a very small extent of how demanding it is to work on a dairy farm, to have a dairy farm. So, was it really tough to add in the time commitment of dairying, plus of course making the actual butter, to your already growing and busy livestock operation?
Yes, it was very tough. But I didn't really think about it, to be honest, at the time, because I was just very excited about the thought of having our own micro dairy and being able to process and make a value-added product. That's sort of been our dream for Ben and I from the get-go, but it's hard to just develop that. So anyway, at the time, this is only 3 years ago, but at that time, I was definitely, I don't know if I was blind to the amount of work it would take, but I was willing to potentially sacrifice other parts of our farm in order to take on this piece. So I really went at it without any concerns about my time. Now, since that has happened, it's been very eye-opening. Just like you're saying, it's one thing to have an understanding of how rigorous a dairy is, and then it's another to be living in it and fully experience year after year the endlessness of it all. So that for me was eye-opening. I'm like, okay, so I knew that, the cows have to get milked every day, all year, regardless of everything. And I knew I would have to be out here processing cream constantly all the time. But I didn't know, you know what I mean?
Right. Until you're actually in it every single day.
Yeah. So it was definitely, I don't regret a single piece of it at all. It's been wonderful. And I think the biggest transition has been for our children, because prior to the dairy, the meat stuff, moving the animals or feeding out hay, it can be flexible, right? It's like, okay, I need to go move the sheep at 7 a.m, but oh wait, we're having a meltdown. We're going to be an hour late. the sheep don't care. It's
Right.
not the end of the world. I mean, they do get mad at me, but that's about it. It's not going to change their production. Like, it's not going to throw the whole day off. It's just 1 hour delayed. But with the dairy, it's like everything is very rigid. So it's like, you're having a meltdown. Okay, nope, doesn't matter. We still have to do it right now. That sort of stuff is really hard with little kids, and they had a pretty quick switch. It's like a light switch, basically, from one kind of lifestyle into the other kind of lifestyle. So it took some adjustment for Ben and I and the kids to get through it. But now that we've been in the same pattern for 3 years, when we do anything that changes the pattern a little bit, it's confusing for the kids. Like they've adjusted to it so much that it's all so normal now.
Yeah. Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So you and Ben bought the creamery from its founder, Diane St. Clair, and she owned it for about 20 years or so. And she really made it into what seems like a very historic staple. So what was it like taking over such a renowned operation?
It was intimidating, I would say, at first.
Yeah.
I felt unsure of how I was supposed to talk about the business, mostly because every product that I had been selling and advocating to so far, Ben and I had created, right? It's like either I grew up with the sheep and knew the details of everything in and out, or Ben and I had created it. So buying something that had been created by someone else was really strange for me because I didn't know it. I didn't have that like deep history in my body of understanding it and its development. So I think the hardest part for me was just being confident about selling this product and talking about the product and explaining to everyone who asks, why is it so special? That was like the biggest question we would get from everyone. And it was just hard for me to talk about it and be like, I mean, you got to taste it. It's like, it was just hard for me to have the terminology to explain it. And so that was really intimidating. And it took a full year for me to sort of get my feet underneath me as far as how to talk about it, and how to manage that piece of it, because that's such an important side of having a value-added product, is to being able to explain why it's different from everything else, and why it's unique. And I was intimidated also because Diane suggested that I call and talk to the chefs who all bought this butter.
Mm-hmm.
In case, just for a little background, just the butter is shipped out every week to a handful of restaurants around the country. And I work sort of directly with the chefs, not on a regular basis. Like I'm in communication with them like a few times through the year, but they know this product very intimately and are very supportive of the business. So Diane was saying, in transfer of my relationship with these chefs, I think you should call and talk to them. So I did. And I was really intimidated because, again, this was all so fresh and new for me. And I know nothing about like the fine dining world and any of their lingo and vocabulary. So I was like, oh my God. But it was very reassuring after I talked to every single one, and they were so grateful that this business was continuing and for the quality of the product, and just anything I needed, reach out anytime. I was kind of floored by their respect and understanding, for me and for the product and for Diane. So it definitely reassured me, but the intimidation of it all, it took probably a good year for me to move past that.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. It's a big kind of leap into this already very well-known thing. So yeah, absolutely. So I saw on your website that the butter, quote, changes with the season. Can you explain why that is and what differences you see in the butter depending on the time of year?
Yes, it changes largely because of their diet.
Mm-hmm.
The quality of the cream is the number one reason why the butter is unique and delicious. And that, of course, is affected by what they're eating. So in the summer, we rotationally graze. So the butter flavors transform to a little bit grassy. The color of the butter changes. It's like a super rich marigold yellow, like sometimes almost seems orangey. And then as summer fades into fall, the butter starts to, and in the summer, the butter is very soft. It very quickly will kind of like melt and get soft. It's a little more challenging to work with. But as the weather cools off and the bugs go away, the color of the butter will start to fade as the grasses die in the fall, and the firmness will start to increase until the cows are fully transitioned onto hay for the winter, and then it's a much milder yellow in color. You sort of lose some of those grassy notes, but you get this different like sweetness of hay flavor in there. Again, it's like you really need to try it to know exactly what I'm talking about, but I'm sure anyone who's had cheeses and stuff can relate to what I'm talking about. But that is why it is a season, changes with the seasons. And I think people have lost that understanding with butter because we're so used to having butter from creameries that get milk from these larger dairies who the cows are inside on TMR. So their diet is much more consistent year round. So they're not used to seeing the changes in butter. So for people, it's important that I explain that, because if you're buying the butter in the summer, it's going to be a different product than what you're buying in the winter, because we're not grazing in the winter. They're on hay. And just like we're all used to that with fruits and other things that we eat, we know that there's a season for a good fruit. And we're used to that changing year round. Dairy is the same, and you can find its benefits in the parts of it you love throughout the year, so.
Yeah. I mean, it makes perfect sense, like hearing the explanation of what the look and the taste will be like throughout the year. But right, like as someone who is used to just buying butter from the grocery store, it doesn't matter what month I buy the butter, it's going to look the same every single time. So it's definitely interesting to like really hear and understand what's actually going on when the cow's, diet is changing throughout the year.
Yeah, I think the chefs really love it because they can explain all of this to the people who are dining in their restaurants and tasting it. It really connects you in a very real way straight back to farming.
6 days a week I saw on your website. So can you walk us through a little bit of what the butter making process is actually like?
Yeah. So the butter is pasteurized. And I will pasteurize 2 to 3 times a week. And the day after I pasteurize will be a churning day. Because I culture the butter, the culture needs to sit in the cream overnight. So, for example, on a Monday, I'll pasteurize, and then I'll add in a culture, and then that cream will sit overnight. And the next day on Tuesday, I'll churn it and work it into butter. And then again, I'll pasteurize on a Wednesday, and then I'll churn on a Thursday, et cetera, et cetera. It's not quite so simple. I often piggyback a lot of my processings with each other. But yeah, that's the creamery side of things, just to make it in a very simple explanation. But of course, it starts with the cows who are milked every day, and their milk is dumped into a bulk tank, which of course chills the milk. And then once the milk is chilled down, I actually turn off my bulk tank so that the cream can rise to the top. And then later that day, before the next milking, I'll actually just ladle the cream off the top of my bulk tank and store it in a tote to be processed probably the next day. Yeah, that's it in a nutshell, the simplicity. I am happy to talk in more detail if you would like.
No,
But it
no,
all gets a little confusing, so I'm trying to just lay it out simply.
yeah, yeah. But obviously for you who's doing it every single day, it's more complicated than it sounds.
Yeah, so it is in concept a very simple process, right?
Right.
But when you're actually doing it, there are some nuances with temperatures and culturing,
Hmm.
in churning and working the butter that come into play and are changing constantly, which is always a challenge. Um, and those are thrown in the mix along with the cow's diet. So as the diet changes, it totally changes how I have to do things in the creamery. And it took me a little while after we brought the creamery here to get all of that under control, to be able to read the cream and everything before it got processed, to know how I needed to adjust things to compensate. So that was, it was super fun, but pretty stressful.
Right.
It's like, oh
Definitely
my
a
God.
pretty a sharp learning curve that you're on.
Yeah. I mean, I never destroyed the butter, but I definitely missed my goal mark as far as workability and that kind of stuff. But it's just so amazing how supportive the chefs were with all of it. It was just, they continued to just say how it was wonderful and all this stuff. So it all went really well, but
Yeah.
it felt stressful.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we've talked a little bit about selling the butter to restaurants, and it's some pretty well-known places, the Inn at Little Washington per se, and the one on your website that really caught my attention, French Laundry. I mean,
Mm.
if anyone listening watches Food Network as much as I do, you've heard about the French Laundry many times. So obviously restaurants of this caliber have such a high standard for their ingredients and the quality of their ingredients. So what I'm sure is probably your favorite question to get. So what makes your butter this special high quality and makes it different than, as we kind of were talking about, like the butter you go out to the grocery store and just pick up?
Right. Yeah, there's a few factors that are really weighing in on this. But the number one, which of course I did mention a little bit, is the quality of the cream. That is really the basis for what makes the butter so delicious. Simple for me to say quality of cream, but what goes into controlling the quality of the cream has to do with the size of our dairy, the breed of our cows, what we're feeding them, how we're managing them. All of those factors are what is controlling the quality of the cream. So because we are small, we are able to really micromanage all of these little details, to keep it exactly how we want it to be. And then moving past the cream quality, it's our processing equipment. Because we're so small, my equipment is very simple and it's all very delicate. For example, instead of a cream separator, I'm hand ladling the cream out of the tank. And it's amazing how much of a difference it does make on the cream, because if you can picture, in the cream is all of these fat globules, right? They're all sort of floating around. And then when you churn cream into butter, those fat globules are bouncing into each other and getting larger and larger and larger to make butter. But before you start churning it, those fat globules, which come out of the cow in probably a pretty large size, they get broken up with every step of the process, running through the pipeline, getting dumped into the bulk tank, getting agitated, getting put through a cream separator. You're joggling up all of those fat globules and breaking them into tinier pieces. So for us, we're trying to control that and just keep the fat globules as large as possible, so that when we churn, it creates a consistency in the butter that you wouldn't find in the supermarket. Okay, so that's the processing side. And then after the equipment piece of it is culturing. So most butter that we are consuming is sweet cream butter. The cream that is churned does not have any cultures added to it. So I am putting in a lactobacillus culture, like a lactic acid, pretty basic culture, in order for the cream pH to change, and it becomes like yogurty, like a sour cream, basically, before it gets churned. And that adds in this little hint of tang in the butter. It's sort of like, I wouldn't say it's the primary flavor, but it adds this little note at the end that is just like the icing on the cake, I guess you could say. And then the butter is, after it's churned, I'm working it just by hand on a marble countertop into butter balls. So yeah, it's just a whole system that creates this product and what makes it unique. And it's interesting going from Diane, the way that she was doing and managing her dairy, to the way that we're doing it. It's very similar in almost every way, except for the fact that Ben and I are also making all of the hay for the cows and utilizing the rest of our farm with the sheep and the beef to make this whole system that is intertwined. And I'm not saying that the way that it was raised before is subpar by any means, but it has been eye-opening for us to see the effect of our entire farm come through in this one product. And it's pretty surreal.
Yeah, I mean, that's very cool to hear kind of a little bit of each step of the way that makes this butter what it is, and how something that maybe feels like a small thing you're doing like plays a pretty big role in the overall end product.
Yeah, it does. It's very hard to convey to most people just how every step of the process has such a direct impact on the final product.
Wow, that's all very fascinating to me, honestly. I've never made butter, and I've definitely never considered making butter in such a like special way. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think it's just probably the case for any farmstead creamery, right? Anyone who, and probably even goats, although they're like a tiny bit simpler than dairy, but than the bovine world. But it's just like everything that you have going on in the barn and outside has a direct impact to what you're doing in the creamery. And that used to be common knowledge, right? Mm-hmm. Hundreds of years ago, that was normal. And we have gotten so far away from that now that it's a concept that's hard to explain to people. So I think anyone who has experience with farmstead operations, creameries, gets it and will understand what I'm talking about. But I mean, I know that you do too, but yeah, it's a very, sorry, I'm blabbering on here, but we have a hard time relaying this message of what I'm saying to a lot of people. It just doesn't quite sink in. So that's why I was excited to be, it's like, oh, a farming podcast. This is great.
Yeah. I mean, it is such a unique operation, you know? I mean, there aren't that many places that are doing what you're doing. So it is something that's a little different, but, you know, very exciting and very cool. So what does being a woman in ag mean to you?
Oh, boy. I don't know that I've ever been asked this question before. I don't know that I go throughout my day-to-day existence, like analyzing my womanly role. Mm-hmm. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But it is interesting as a woman in agriculture. I do find that there are very specific roles that I am good at. And some of them are very traditional. And I'm totally okay with that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It was interesting when I first started farming. I felt very much the pressure of fighting a traditional, like, woman's role of like, I'm going to do all the kitchen work and the housework, and then I'm going to feed the lambs. It was like, I felt like I needed to be able to fix all the equipment and do all the haying and learn how to be mechanical and build all the fence and run the chainsaw to cut all the fence line. Like, I just really felt that that was important for me. But as I've become a mother and very much grounded in my farming life and of just who I am very content being very good at specific tasks. And I do tend to gravitate towards my domestic duties. I actually really love picking up the house, even though it's never picked up, and doing the laundry. And I love doing all the creamery work. And I'm very observant. So it's really, I'm the one who is doing a lot of the cow health observations and caretaking of the animals. And I really enjoy it, and it feels good. I don't know if that at all answers or, is what you're thinking of for an answer, but
Yeah, no, I mean, we close every interview with this question, and it's always
okay.
lovely to hear the unique and different ways that, every woman seems to relate. And it's not, there is no one size fits all answer. And
Right.
So I think it's beautiful that like you're embracing the things that you're passionate about and you love doing, and whether that's the more traditional like feminine roles or not. I don't think there's a right or wrong way to do it. So
right. And for me, I've learned about myself that I really enjoy having the children be a part of everything. It took a while starting out farming, feeling like I always needed someone to watch the kids or hang out with them while I went and did my stuff. But I've learned that, yeah, it's not always like wonderful when they're with you doing farming stuff, but it's really enjoyable in general at the end. And it's why we had our third baby. It's like I wanted to be able to include one from the very beginning, like, in our life and in the farm. And it's been very enjoyable.
Well, thank you so much, Hilary, for joining us at the farmhouse. It was really great getting to know more about you and your farm.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was fun.
I really enjoyed listening to your conversation with Hilary. I feel like I learned so much about butter. And one of the things that I was looking forward to learning about was what makes Hilary's butter so special, because when we learned that you were going to be talking to her, we did some research, and I think we both had some sticker shock over how much Hilary's butter actually sells for. I was sitting there thinking, like, what is it about this butter that, makes it worth paying that much money? And I liked hearing her talk about, like, the quality of the cream and how her being a smaller operation allows for much more control over what the cows are eating, how they're living, and just how the process seems so much more artisan than I think you would normally get. Definitely not, you're not going to experience that from the butter that you get at the supermarket. So I get it. I would be very interested to know if I would be able to taste the difference. I don't think I have a very refined palate, so it might be lost on someone like me, but I would still like to try it and see.
I mean, I will say, even just by like looking at photos of it online, you can tell it looks very different than like a typical stick of butter from the grocery store, which leads me to think that it would taste better or different at least. And I'm like, but maybe that's also just you're looking at it and you know where it came from and the whole like process that she went through to create it and all of that, and maybe it would be a little in your head, but I don't know. I think it looks beautiful. So to me, I feel like I think it would taste different.
I feel like you would definitely know something's different if you got the marigold butter that she was talking about, where she was like, sometimes it's a different color. And I was thinking, like, what would I do if I sat down at a restaurant and they're like, here's your bread and butter, and the butter was like close to orange? I think it would definitely throw me for a loop because I've never encountered that before. But I thought it was interesting, like, it made me think about how we hold certain foods to kind of odd standards, even though certain things don't matter. Like, I'm thinking about the ugly fruits and vegetables that, even though they're technically ugly, they still taste the same. They still taste delicious. So orange butter, ugly strawberries.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I feel like I don't care what a strawberry looks like. It's my favorite fruit, pretty much. Like, I'll eat any strawberry.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what the shape is. So I guess there is that thing with farm fresh food where it does, maybe just in my head it tastes better, but I do think it does actually taste better, where you know, like,
Well, fresh is always better.
you know exactly where it came from. And I feel, talking to Hilary, like, the chefs love knowing exactly where their butter's coming from, and then being able to also explain that to their patrons as well. So, like, sounds great. Maybe we'll have to pool together an office fund and order some butter.
Can we expense some butter from can we expense a trip to the French Laundry?
Oh, that's actually even better, because then we'd get the butter and so much more.
We'll have to look into it, I suppose. Well, I think that wraps it up for us. Thank you all for listening. If you liked this episode, please consider subscribing if you haven't already done so. If you really liked this episode, please consider leaving us a review.
If you have any questions or thoughts about this episode, you can email us at farmhouse@lancasterfarming.com.
You can also find us on social media at Lancaster Farming on most platforms.
Thank you again for listening and visiting us at the farmhouse. I'm Stephanie.
And I'm Candace.
We'll talk to you later.
Bye!
This episode of The Farmhouse is copyright 2025 by Lancaster Farming newspaper, part of the Steinman Communications family.
It was written by Stephanie Spiker and Candace Wierzbowski. It was produced by Eric Herlock and Sophia Kurzius. The music you've heard throughout the show is courtesy of Tin Bird Shadow.